Good day to you. I've been in Stonehaven for near on 40 years now, but naturally I'm still in a boot comer, and so I'm a wee bit cheerier setting myself up as only kind of expert on a tune. But for a cross-the-grain festival I've been asked to do a voiceover for one of these film stravags. And as I sat down there I've done often enough myself. Friend of mine once said to me as we were coming down the brae past the golf club out there, "Here's Stoney like a we'll keep it secret." Aye, there's nae doubt it never fails to amaze me with just how bonny a place it can be. And that view as you come down into it must ha. This walk along the beach is aye fine. The sea's awa high out today to be sure, but it's still a constant backdrop to the tune. There's a sculpture here by Stoney's Boxie, for recently turned out to be local man Jim Malcolm. It's a drifter like my grandad's, and gay bonny made it at. The walk's fair dotted with his sculptures. We'll see a lighthouse in a minute. Now, I'm nae going to speak an awful lot about him, for he likes to keep himself to himself, and quite recht. But I was off at with his comment, "The sea to me means freedom." Now that speaks volumes to me. I was born and brought up with its rushing in my ears and its sad breath in my face. When I first come here, I'd bid for near 10 years in Hawick, a bonny place, fine folk, twa beautiful rivers running through it, the Tweed and the Cheviot. But it wasn't till I moved here on the very first night that I kent what I'd been missing. It was the soom of the sea. Far I come fae in Peterheid, there's nae way you can stand without hearing whispering or roaring, depending on what the wind's doing. As a loon, I passed most days in summer down on the shore, playing with my pals or by myself, catching crabs, biling buckies in an old tin can, being sick after, clarting myself in a slurch of sand and war and fish cut and salt water. With other games and all, running and rolling down the sand dunes for the bints. Great fun, but the sand fair got in your hair. That game was dangerous. You had to run as fast as you could over the tops of a rocky outcrop, often a slittered wet green gar. It was alright as long as you keep it going, but a minute of swithering, and you could be breaking your legs or war. There was a loon younger than me was fun drowned when the tide went out a morning. His leg was broken. He must have been doomed on his own and taken a cope and never been able to get back up and peer sourly to wait for the tide coming in. We gave up that game after that. That view in front of us is Bellman Head and there's a puckle scurries. Fit else, you canna get far away for scurries at the seaside. Files anywhere else nowadays, the limmers are our way. On our right here's the old Tolbooth. It's the oldest building in the town by long chalk. At first it was bigged as a store, but when the town became a county town, they needed a sheriff courthouse and a jail. Near 200 years of folk being told off, fined, jailed, branded or even hanged. The gallows were up at the Northwords. Pirates were hanged for here, and Anglican ministers imprisoned until I ended up conducting, were told, baptisms through a window at the back. Saying it went back to being a store. Near fell into ruin, but was restored and turned into a museum. It's nowadays run by a bunch of local volunteers. And very well run too. It's a fine place to visit. It fair took me back to when I was a young dominie with squeal desk and the tars it has in't. I was fair tempted to try it out, but couldn't find anybody willing to hold up their hand. In front of us now is a harbour. And there ahead us are the Bervie braes. There's been folk biding in the lee of them since long afore the Romans. Out the south of yont Belmont Headout is secht as the Dunnecare Rock, for there was a Pictish fort and Bronze Age relics. It's been a harbour of refuge since weel afore there was ever a harbour, for men would haul their boats up to safety out of the storm. Vikings landed here in twa headlands to the south in the shadow of the Notter. A king of Picts was killed by a Viking king. French soldiers came ashore here on their way to help bonnie Prince Charlie. And the whole place was kent as a nest of piracy until the 17th century. Mind you, that's just what folk from Aberdeen said. Some of the buildings along the front here are gayal and a'. The ship in there was bigot in 1711 and the marine just along for it in the 19th century. It's aye been a fine place to come for a drink with some pals on a fine summer's night when you can stand at the harbour while we your drink. Or even better to sit coedited by the fire at the window, with drama on a wild winter's night looking out at the spray surging over the top of the breakwater out there. Every time I come out in of them until the swishing harbour sounds at night, I'm minded in lines of Norman McCaig's about leaving a west coast houff, probably somewhere like Ullapool or Oban at closing time. They will trail noisily out, injecting a guff of alcohol into the salty smell made up of brine and seaweed and fish, which stretches from the pub door all the way to America. My mate and me, we often just stand and listen till the seas sough afore we gang hame. And files think that water stretching all the way to Norway. Next to the marine is an old grain store, reminding us that Stoney wasn't just a fishing town. Its harbour was at the centre of shipping in necessities like coal and lime, and shipping out the produce of the whole country round about, grain and tatties and whisky. It's been a dwelling for long enough now, but you can still see if it was. Steenhive's aye been associated with the sea, and it's still at its heart. And at the heart of that was the fishing. There's still a bit of fishing for here nowadays, but nae muckle compared to what there ance was. More nor 100 years ago, at the end of the 19th century, there were well abeen 200 boats registered here, and nearly 70 actually working out of the harbour. And for the time, that's big kind boats, I mean, elk een crewed with 5 or more men. The whole shore head would have been a hive of activity. Coopers making barrels for a fish, carters taking up the station, folk kippering, mending nets, a wee army of queens gutting a fish. The back-up folk like chandlers, rope makers, sail makers. It's been estimated that well over 1,200 folk work it here at the harbour at its height. There's still een or twa fish for here and 50 fitters, but the most of the boats that use the harbour now are recreational. Mine, it's got room for about 140 boaties, and it's used a lot files in the summertime. There's been a pier to the north for several hundred years, but the breaker in the south harbour only came about in the 19th century. And it minds me of a story. When I was a loon, I used to love listening to my granda and I's all fisher cronies newsing and blethering awa to lean another at the corner along from my father's shop. Files that tell stories that made you think about life. Files that was tales of bravery at sea lang syne. Files that would be deeply religious, elk een of them mindful that the good Lord had ta'en fisher folk as his disciples. Files that was about loss and hardship and coping with them both. Other times it was just lees from start to finish, with everybody nodding in appreciation of how clever like the storyteller was at adding curlicues to embroider the tale. There were times too when a story was designed to catch out the gullible, usually with me as a young loon being seen as fair game as a target. But the story I mind best was about Steenhive Harbour. I couldn't do justice to the story as they telled it, but it was all about this young fisher loon, Fast Feather handed him a wheel as they were coming in about Stoney's Harbour. The loon, of course, got a swithered and fair ca'd a tow with a bucket, making a complete sotter attack in the boat and about. Nae least owing to the muckle steen that lay in the harbour mouth. The mistakes that the loon made were detailed, and it was a genuinely funny story. I must have heard it 2 or 3 times. I think it was the second or third telling that it dawned on me that onybody had heard that story would ken fit why to take a boat until Stony Harbour. I didn't think muckle mair about it until I was here some years later, and realised there wasna a steen in the harbour mouth at all. In asking, I learned that a hale burach of rocks had been there, but it was all blown up in the early 1800s. And yet, that story was still being told by fishermen in Peterheid more than 150 years after the thing was taken away. Guid stories hae a life of their own. It was one of the Lechthouse Stevensons that got rid of it, which kinda takes us back to where we started, Lechthouses. The nearest thing to us when I was young was at Buchan-Ness, a great muckle reading fight striped thing that like a great stack of rock. I used to lie in my bed in foggy nights, cooried down below the blankets, listening to the foghorn moaning, like some great sea monster. I even wrote a poem about it. Fog. Lighthouses moaned on foggy nights, while darkness clasped its soft, dank, clammy fingers round my window and dribbled, slithered rivulets erratic down its pane. Whiles my seaside world seemed softly blurred and moistly threatening. Whiles streets flared with fuzzy lampposts, self-absorbed in useless light. That's when I'd take my childhood bedclothes round my head and shiver in its cave-like warmth. Fog's creature howled its siren call across the troubled waters to a moon unseen. Men were lost on nights like this. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your dander round Stony Harbour. Hist you back.
Dum